1945, the war was over, but for thousands of captured German women, a new kind of shock awaited them. They had marched through mud, hunger and fear, watching cities burn and nations crumble. Now, behind the barbed wire of an American POW camp, they expected punishment, starvation, revenge. But what greeted them was something else entirely. In the quiet dawn of a camp somewhere in the American Midwest, mist rolled over the barracks, and the air carried a smell that made them stop in disbelief. Bacon, thick, rich, and warm. The smell drifted between the wooden huts, curling into the cold morning air like a memory of a life they thought had vanished forever. To women who had scoured garbage piles for food only months before, the sizzling of bacon was almost cruel in its kindness. They whispered among themselves, "Was this a trick? Could this possibly be real?" Some wept quietly. Others just stared wide-eyed as American cooks in clean aprons flipped golden slices on hot metal griddles. The war had taken everything. Homes, families, even dignity. But in that moment, for the first time in years, they smelled something that spoke not of war, but of life. The smell of bacon, the smell of peace. Soft orchestral music swells, the camera pans across the camp, the smoke, the faces of disbelief. When the female German prisoners first arrived, the world around them felt like a ghostly echo of the chaos they had escaped. It was late 1945. Europe lay in ruins. Cities turned to rubble, villages burned to ashes, and hearts scarred by years of terror. These women had come from every corner of the fallen Reich, nurses, clerks, auxiliaries, and widows who had once served or followed the army. Some were still in uniform, others barefoot and shivering, their faces hollow from hunger and fear. When the trucks finally stopped and the gates of the American camp swung open, they stood frozen in disbelief. The sound of boots on gravel echoed through the chill air, and for the first time in months no one was shouting at them. No dogs barked. No whips cracked. Just the quiet murmur of an American guard saying, "Welcome to camp, ladies." Many didn't understand the words, but they understood the tone. It was not the voice of an enemy. It was calm, steady, and even polite. That alone unsettled them more than rage would have. They had been taught to expect vengeance. Their officers had told them that the Allies would treat Germans worse than animals, that they would be starved, beaten, used as slaves until they collapsed. Yet as they were led through the gates, the sight that met them was something out of another world. Wooden barracks, standing neatly in rows, a flag fluttering in the distance, and beyond the fence, green fields stretching toward the horizon. The air smelled clean. It carried hints of pine earth and something else, something rich and warm. They couldn't name it yet, but it made their stomachs ache with memory. Hunger had become part of their bodies, an ache that never left. But this scent was different from the acrid smoke of war. It was food, real food, something cooking, something they hadn't smelled since their childhood kitchens. They were lined up, counted, and given small canvas bags for personal items. Each woman moved stiffly, clutching the few things she still owned. A comb, a photograph, maybe a worn handkerchief. For months they had lived off scraps and mud, scavenging from bombed villages and soldiers' rations. Some had walked for weeks after surrendering, sleeping under trees soaked by rain. Yet here, in the heart of their captors' land, they saw wooden floors, cots with blankets, even soap waiting on washstands. The guards wore clean uniforms, spoke softly among themselves, and nodded politely as the new prisoners passed. As they reached the mess hall, the smell grew stronger. It was intoxicating, Thick curls of smoke drifted from a chimney above the low wooden building. Inside, the sound of metal clattering and grease popping echoed through the still morning air. Bacon. They didn't know it yet, but that smell would burn itself into their memories for the rest of their lives. It was sharp, rich, and almost sweet. It mingled with the faint scent of coffee and bread, wrapping the camp in a warmth that felt almost cruel in its comfort. The women hesitated at the doorway. They had been prisoners of the British, the French, even the Russians before. They had known what it meant to starve, to be thrown stale bread and watery soup like livestock, to be struck if they didn't move fast enough. But here the guards didn't shove them forward. They simply gestured toward the benches and said a few words. Breakfast soon. Inside the mess hall, American cooks worked over large iron stoves, their sleeves rolled up, talking casually as they turned sizzling pans. The scent of bacon fat filled the air, mingled with the warmth of fresh eggs and bread. The women watched in silence, half believing this must be a cruel trick. Their minds told them they were still prisoners, but their senses betrayed them. Everything here felt wrong in a way that was strangely right. Some of the women began to cry softly. The sound was barely audible, but it spread like a quiet wave through the group. Not loud sobbing, just small, trembling breaths as tears slid down their cheeks. One of them, a young woman named Clara, whispered to another, "Do you smell that? It smells like home." The other nodded without answering. She had no words. Home was a word that had lost meaning somewhere between the bombings and the surrender. But now, the scent of frying bacon, something she hadn't known existed in such abundance, awakened a forgotten part of her soul. The guards didn't mock them. They didn't even seem to notice. They were busy cleaning tables, stacking trays, and pouring water into metal pitchers. Everything ran like clockwork. Even captivity here had a rhythm, one built not on fear, but on routine. When the prisoners were finally called to eat, most of them hesitated. Their instincts told them to wait, to expect punishment if they took too much or moved too fast. Yet the Americans stood by quietly, arms folded, watching them with mild patience. "Go on," one said softly, motioning with his hand. The women stepped forward. Inside the hall, rows of long tables were set up, simple but orderly. Metal trays glinted under the lights. And then they saw it, the source of that scent. Strips of bacon, golden and glistening with fat, stacked high beside scrambled eggs, toast, and potatoes. The sight was almost surreal. For a moment, no one moved. They stared at the food like it was a mirage. In their minds, it had to be. How could the enemy, the Americans, feed them like this? Some whispered prayers under their breath, unsure if they were thanking God or begging him not to wake them from this dream. An older woman, grey-haired and thin as a reed, reached out first. Her hand trembled as she picked up a slice of bacon. She held it close, inhaling deeply before daring to take a bite. The taste hit her like memory. Salt, fat, warmth, life. It filled her with something she hadn't felt in years. Safety. Others followed. Slowly, tentatively, they began to eat. The room filled with the quiet sounds of chewing, of spoons against metal trays, of sighs that were half sobs. They didn't talk. There was nothing to say. For once, words didn't matter. What mattered was that the war was truly over. Not just on paper, but here in this simple act of kindness. To the American soldiers, it was just breakfast. To the German women, it was redemption on a plate. Outside, the morning sun rose higher, washing the camp in gold. Smoke drifted gently from the chimneys. A guard leaned on the fence post, watching the sky. Somewhere a bird sang. Life was returning in small, hesitant steps. In that moment, the smell of bacon became a symbol, not of luxury or gluttony, but of humanity, of what it meant to be treated as a person again. These women had lived through fire, had seen men hanged and children buried. They had seen their country turn into ashes. Yet here, in the land of their conquerors, they found something that felt almost like forgiveness. Later, many of them would write about it in diaries or tell their children in hushed tones, not about battles or politics, but about that morning, about the strange, almost sacred power of that smell, the smell that told them they had survived, that the world, though broken, could still be kind. One recalled, "I had not smelled bacon in 6 years. When I did, I realized for the first time that the war was really over." For those who lived through it, that moment remained untouched by time. Even decades later, when they were old and grey, they would pause in a kitchen, smell breakfast cooking, and be transported back to that camp, to the quiet morning when they discovered that even in captivity, mercy could exist. It wasn't grand speeches or gestures that healed them. It was small things: warmth, order, food, and dignity. In a world that had forgotten what decency looked like, the Americans reminded them in the simplest way possible through a meal. And though history rarely mentions the women's camps, those who were there never forgot the first day, the day they arrived expecting hate and were met with the smell of bacon. When the Americans finally called them to eat, the silence in the camp felt heavier than the barbed wire around it. The women had been standing for what felt like hours, unsure whether to believe what they were seeing. Rows of tables, trays stacked neatly, the smell of real food filling the air. It was too much, too strange. Hunger had long since become something more than an ache. It was a part of them now, something that lived in their bones and clouded their thoughts. But this hunger was different. It wasn't born of desperation anymore. It was mingled with disbelief, confusion, even fear. The first guard who spoke gestured gently toward the mess hall, saying something in English that most couldn't understand. But his tone was calm, not commanding. He wasn't barking orders. He was inviting them. The women looked at one another, searching each other's faces for guidance. Could this really be happening? Was this some sort of trick before punishment? For so long, food had been a weapon, given and taken to break their will. They moved slowly, cautiously, like animals creeping toward something they didn't trust. Boots crunched on gravel. The wind carried the smell of bacon again, stronger now, richer. It drifted from the kitchen in soft waves, and their stomachs clenched painfully. The last real meal many of them had eaten had been months ago, before surrender. Most had survived on scraps, boiled weeds, raw potatoes, crusts traded for bits of cloth. Some had even stolen food from the dead on the long march west. Now, as they neared the mess hall, they could hear the soft clatter of metal trays, the quiet voices of American cooks, and the faint hum of a radio playing a tune they didn't recognize. Inside, the air was thick and warm. Bacon fat hissed on hot pans, and the smell mixed with eggs, coffee, and freshly baked bread. The cooks moved quickly, talking in low tones. One of them, a young man no older than 20, looked up when he saw the women enter. His expression wasn't one of hatred. It was pity, or maybe just quiet understanding. He handed a tray to the first guard, who nodded and motioned for the women to step forward. No one moved. The silence deepened. Then, one of the older prisoners, frail, with hollow cheeks and eyes that had seen too much, took a step forward. Her hands trembled as she reached for a tray. The guard nodded again, gently guiding her toward the line. Slowly the others followed. The line moved in silence, broken only by the rhythmic clink of ladles and the faint sizzle of food. Each woman received the same meal: scrambled eggs, a slice of toast, a few strips of bacon, and a tin cup filled with dark, steaming coffee. It was more food than some of them had seen in weeks. They took their trays and sat on wooden benches, unsure if they were allowed to eat yet. Their eyes darted toward the guards, waiting for a signal. When one of the cooks gestured toward his own mouth and smiled, they realized it was okay, they could eat. The first bites came hesitantly. One woman lifted a strip of bacon to her lips, her hand shaking so badly that the piece fell back onto the tray. She stared at it for a moment, as if gathering the courage to try again. Then she picked it up, took a small bite, and froze. Her eyes filled with tears. It was as if her body remembered something her mind had forgotten: warmth, comfort, life. She chewed slowly, tasting salt and smoke and fat. And for a moment she wasn't a prisoner anymore. She was a child in her mother's kitchen, before the war, before the fear. Around her, the others began to eat too. The first few bites were tentative, almost suspicious. Then hunger took over. Quietly, reverently, they began to devour the food. The room filled with the soft sound of eating, a sound that was both pitiful and sacred. No one spoke. They just ate, as if speaking would break the spell. Some began to cry openly. Tears rolled down faces hollowed by starvation. One woman, perhaps in her 20s, covered her mouth with both hands as she wept. The cook watching her pretended not to notice. Another whispered, "Danke," her voice barely audible. The word crossed the air like a fragile bridge between enemies. The coffee, bitter and strong, felt strange in their stomachs. Many hadn't tasted it since before the bombings. They sipped carefully, afraid of wasting even a drop. The toast was soft and warm, the eggs light and rich. But it was the bacon that broke them. It wasn't just food. It was everything they had lost. It was a taste of normal life, of mornings before sirens and soldiers. It was the memory of family breakfasts, of laughter, of peace. For years they had lived in deprivation, so complete it had dulled their humanity. The war had stripped them of identity, leaving only survival. But now, as they sat in this hall, still technically prisoners, still surrounded by guards, they began to feel something stirring inside them again. Not pride, not yet, but dignity. They were being fed not as enemies, but as people. The guards stood back, quiet, respectful. They didn't shout or rush the women. Some of them even smiled faintly when they saw how carefully the prisoners held their trays. A few guards exchanged glances that seemed to say the same thing. These women could be our sisters, our mothers. Minutes passed. Slowly, the tension began to fade. The women's movements grew less rigid, their expressions softer. Some even dared to whisper to one another, their voices trembling with emotion. "Can you believe this?" one said. "They're feeding us like guests." Another laughed weakly. "I think I've forgotten what bacon tastes like." The laughter died quickly, replaced by tears again, but it was a start. The meal went on in near silence. Steam rose from the trays, mingling with the smell of cooked fat and coffee. Sunlight streamed through the small windows, turning the rising smoke into golden haze. Outside, the world was still rebuilding itself, but in that mess hall, for a brief moment, the war was truly gone. When the women finished eating, most of them sat quietly, staring at their empty trays. They didn't know what to do. For years, every moment of their existence had been dictated: when to wake, when to march, when to eat, when to fear. Now, they were being treated with decency. It felt alien, almost painful. One by one, they began to rise, uncertain. The cooks came by to collect the trays, nodding in silent acknowledgement. As they filed out of the hall, one woman turned back. The cook who had handed her the tray earlier was wiping down a table. She hesitated, then raised her hand in a small gesture of thanks. The cook looked up, met her eyes, and simply nodded. It was a small moment, invisible to history, but to her it meant everything. That night, the women lay in their bunks, the warmth of the meal still lingering in their stomachs. They whispered quietly to one another, sharing fragments of disbelief. Some said they thought the Americans were trying to confuse them, to make them drop their guard. But others shook their heads. No. One said softly, "This is something else. This is kindness." It was strange to say the word aloud. Kindness had been absent from their lives for so long that it sounded foreign. But that was what it was. Not manipulation, not propaganda. Just human kindness. For days afterward, the smell of breakfast became part of their mornings. It drifted through the barracks like a memory they could never quite escape. Each time they smelled it, they felt the same jolt of emotion. The mix of guilt, gratitude, and awe. They were still prisoners, but they were no longer treated as if they were less than human. One morning, a young German nurse whispered to the woman beside her, "When I smell bacon now, I think of mercy." Her words hung in the air for a moment before the others nodded. Mercy. It was not something they expected to find behind barbed wire. They began to realize something deeper. The Americans were not feeding them to show off their wealth or to humiliate them. They were doing it because they believed it was right. Even in war, especially in war, there were lines they would not cross. That realization broke through years of hatred and propaganda. And as the days passed, the women began to change. They stood a little taller. They started cleaning their quarters with care, helping each other wash clothes, speaking to the guards without fear. The food had done more than fill their stomachs. It had begun to heal them. The smell of bacon each morning became a quiet promise that the brutality of the past was giving way to something new. It was more than a meal. It was an act of rebuilding, one that no treaty could write and no speech could declare. The women who once thought they'd die as enemies of America now began to see the soldiers around them differently. They weren't monsters. They were young men, far from home, trying to do something decent in the ruins of a cruel world. Years later, when some of these women returned to Germany, they would tell their children and grandchildren about that first meal. They didn't speak of battles or losses. They spoke of the smell of bacon, of how the enemy had fed them like human beings when their own world had forgotten what humanity looked like. That moment stayed with them for the rest of their lives. Because sometimes the greatest act of peace is not a handshake or a treaty. It's a plate of hot food offered to someone who thought they didn't deserve it. Days slowly turned into weeks, and as time passed, the strange rhythm of life inside the American POW camp began to feel almost normal. For the German women who had arrived hollow-eyed and trembling, those mornings filled with the smell of bacon had become a quiet, unspoken ritual, one that marked the passing of fear into something they could hardly believe, possible peace. Every sunrise brought with it the same soft chorus, the whistle of wind through fences, the sound of boots on gravel, and that unmistakable scent rising from the mess hall kitchens. It came before the sun itself, curling through the cold air, drifting between barracks, waking the camp with gentle insistence. And each time they smelled it, the women felt something stir deep within. A memory of home, of safety, of life before everything turned to ruin. At first, they thought the feeling would fade. They assumed the Americans were trying to maintain order, to keep the prisoners docile by offering comfort. But soon they realized something else was at work. It wasn't manipulation. It was humanity. These daily breakfasts weren't grand gestures or propaganda. They were simple acts of decency, repeated until they began to heal wounds that bullets and bombs could never touch. Some mornings, the women would gather near the mess hall early, just to stand in the steam rising from the griddles. They would watch the cooks, men in aprons, laughing softly, flipping pans with practiced ease. The smell of bacon fat hissing on hot iron became their unofficial signal that another day had begun. Even those who had lost faith in everything, God, nation, people, found themselves quietly whispering prayers of thanks, not to victory or leaders, but for the warmth of food and the mercy of their captors. The routine gave their days shape. They woke, washed, lined up, ate, and worked, gardening, sewing, helping in the kitchens or laundry. But it was the morning meal that mattered most. The first bite of crisp bacon or soft bread reminded them that they were alive. It told them that war, no matter how cruel, had not completely destroyed compassion. For many, that realization came with tears they could no longer suppress. Some wept openly at the tables, others silently in their bunks at night. They weren't crying for hunger anymore, but for everything they had lost. Families scattered, homes bombed into dust, the lives they had once known. And yet, even through the sorrow, there was something quietly transforming in them. Gratitude, not the kind taught in speeches or prayers, but the wordless kind that grows when someone you feared chooses to show you mercy instead of wrath. The American guards, too, began to see the change. When the women first arrived, they had been stiff and frightened, barely speaking, their eyes downcast. Now, weeks later, there were shy smiles exchanged at the gate, hesitant greetings, even laughter. One morning a guard passed, a small piece of paper folded neatly, a drawing, a few German words scrawled beneath it. It was a sketch of the camp kitchen, smoke rising from the stovepipes, with the caption, Der Geruch von Frieden, the smell of peace. The guard didn't understand the words, but he understood the meaning. It was a strange thing, this quiet understanding that grew between captor and captive. They were still separated by wire and uniform, by language and history, but something invisible had begun to bridge the gap. It wasn't friendship, not yet, but it was respect, mutual and cautious. Every morning, the ritual repeated itself. The cooks arrived before dawn, stoking fires, preparing the day's rations. Bacon, eggs, coffee, bread, simple foods. Yet to the prisoners, they carried weight beyond measure. When the smell drifted through the camp, the women would rise from their bunks, comb their hair, straighten their clothes, and line up with quiet dignity. The guards would count them, nodding in acknowledgement, and then lead them toward the mess hall where warmth awaited. One of the younger prisoners, barely 19, wrote later in her diary that the smell of bacon was like hearing birds sing after years of silence. She described how the first time she had eaten it, she'd felt guilt more than joy. Guilt that she could sit in comfort while so many back home starved in ruins. But over time, that guilt changed into something deeper, a recognition that survival itself was not a crime. Perhaps, she wrote, it is not a sin to be treated kindly. Perhaps it is what the world needs most. The Americans didn't preach to them. They didn't force lessons or slogans. They simply treated them with decency. That, more than any lecture or order, began to reshape the women's understanding of the world. They had grown up believing that their enemies were monsters, brutal, soulless, merciless. Yet here, behind fences, they saw men who worked hard, smiled easily, and shared food without hatred. The simplicity of that truth cut deeper than any weapon could. The women began to help in the kitchens themselves, under supervision. They scrubbed pots, carried trays, peeled potatoes, learning bits of English as they worked. The cook sometimes joked with them, pointing at the food, teaching them words, bacon, coffee, good morning. They would repeat them shyly, sometimes laughing, sometimes blushing, the language barrier softening with each passing day. In those moments, the war felt far away, like a terrible dream receding into the distance. When breakfast ended, the smell lingered for hours, in the air, on their hands, on their clothes. It became a part of the camp's identity. Even visitors from outside the compound, supply drivers, officers, clerks, would remark on it. "You can smell this place before you see it," one said. But for the women, that smell meant something sacred. It was proof that cruelty did not have the final word. Over time, the prisoners began to write letters home, carefully censored but full of small details. They told their families that they were treated fairly, that they had warm beds, that they ate 3 times a day. Some even wrote that they had never eaten so well. The idea shocked their relatives, many of whom were still living on meager rations amid the rubble of Germany. It seemed impossible that life in captivity could hold comfort. But the letters were true. One woman later recalled, "It was in that camp that I learned what civilization really means. It wasn't power or conquest or pride. It was the way they fed us, even when they didn't have to." The Americans themselves may not have thought much of it. They were following orders, running a camp efficiently, maintaining morale. But what they did, the quiet, consistent kindness shown through simple meals, carried a message far beyond the camp fences. It told those women that the world could begin again, not with speeches or flags, but with compassion. As winter approached, the breakfasts took on even more meaning. The mornings were cold and grey, the ground hard with frost, but the smell of bacon still drifted through the air like a promise. It gave warmth before the food ever reached their lips. For many, it became the first sign each day that life continued, that even after everything, there was still something good left to hold on to. Some of the women began to pray again, quietly, whispering before meals. Not for victory, not for revenge, but for gratitude. Gratitude for life, for survival, for mercy. Others began to smile when they saw the guards nodding in quiet acknowledgement. One even offered to mend a torn uniform sleeve for a young soldier, who stood awkwardly as she stitched it, unsure how to thank her. In that small act, the war between them seemed to vanish. Just for a moment, the smell of bacon, once a mere reminder of hunger, had become something symbolic, the scent of healing, of forgiveness unspoken. It carried within it everything that war had tried to destroy: warmth, memory, and shared humanity. And long after they were released, long after the fences came down and the camps were empty, those women remembered. Decades later, in interviews and memoirs, they didn't talk about guards with guns or the endless roll calls. They talked about the mornings, the smell, the food that made them feel human again. One of them, in her old age, said softly to a journalist, "You can never forget the smell of bacon after a war." It was the smell of peace itself. The journalist had smiled, perhaps not fully understanding, but she meant it literally. That scent, rising over the wooden huts, had been the first real sign that life, ordinary, decent life, had returned. It wasn't about the taste or the meal. It was about what it represented, the idea that even after years of hate, people could still care for one another. Because peace doesn't always come with parades or signatures. Sometimes it arrives quietly, in the hands of a cook serving breakfast to his former enemy. And so, each morning in that camp, the ritual continued. Smoke rising against the dawn, laughter in the kitchen, prisoners standing in line, and the world slowly learning to be kind again. The bacon sizzled, the coffee steamed, and the war, little by little, drifted further into memory. It began with food, but it became something far greater, a symbol of reconciliation so humble it would never make the history books, yet so powerful it lived forever in the hearts of those who witnessed it.